It's time, old friend. Rest now.
Imagine an ordinary spring day that suddenly turns into the beginning of the end of the world. It starts to rain and simply doesn't stop for months on end. This isn't the plot of a Hollywood disaster movie. It's the true story of Europe in 1315. The Great Famine killed millions of people and forced ordinary peasants to make impossible decisions. Today, we're used to always having food at the nearest supermarket. If one crop fails, we simply import food from another country. In the Middle Ages, such logistics did not exist. Your life depended entirely on what grew in the field behind your house. If the field turned into a swamp, the community began to slowly die. And this is where it gets really interesting. People had to choose which family members would live and which would not. This sounds like absolute madness to a modern person, but for a 14th century peasant, it was the harsh mathematics of survival. They weren't cruel monsters. They were hostages to a system in which there simply wasn't enough food to go around. The spring of 1315 began as usual. Peasants plowed the fields and sowed precious grain into the earth, and then water poured down from the sky. It rained every day for several months in a row. Modern meteorologists call this a climatic anomaly. Europe at that time knew nothing of rubber boots or waterproof jackets. People were literally drowning in mud along with their hopes for a harvest. The fields turned into vast, rotting swamps. The seeds simply rotted in the ground, never sprouting. My feet start to freeze just thinking about it. Now we can predict the weather a week in advance using satellites. In the Middle Ages, the only forecast came from the local priest. He would simply say that God was angry with people for their sins, and the peasants sincerely believed that they needed to pray harder. But prayers did not stop the endless stream of icy water from the heavens. The level of despair grew with every new drop. Sounds strange, doesn't it? Why didn't they just go somewhere else? Because there was absolutely nowhere to run. The rain covered a vast area from Ireland to Poland. All of Northern Europe turned into one giant puddle. Let's look at this from a caloric perspective. A medieval peasant consumed about 3,000 calories a day. It was hard physical labor from dawn to dusk. Without that amount of energy, a person would simply drop dead. The main source of those calories was bread, and now that bread simply refused to grow. When the first crop failed, people tried to plant grain a second time. This was a huge risk for any village. They used their sacred seed reserve, which they kept for emergencies, but the heavens remained unforgiving. The second crop was also washed away by endless streams of water. By winter, the situation had become nothing short of catastrophic. There was no food at all. In a normal year, supplies lasted exactly until the following spring. Now the granaries were completely empty as early as December. People began to look at one another with growing horror. This brings us to the concept of food security. Today, governments have massive reserves in case of disasters. They have warehouses, canned goods, and frozen foods. A medieval village lived day to day. Their entire reserve consisted of a few sacks of grain in a wooden shed, and now that shed was empty. Your office job may seem stressful, but you hardly ever wake up thinking you have nothing to eat. Medieval people faced absolute uncertainty. They knew the next harvest wouldn't come for another year, and surviving until then was practically impossible. That's how the climate brought down an entire civilization. Ordinary rain did what enemy armies couldn't. It deprived people of their basic right to exist. A long and agonizing struggle for survival began. And that struggle required making monstrous decisions. To understand the scale of the tragedy, you need to look at a medieval pantry. It's not a modern refrigerator with lighting and plenty of shelves. It's a dark and damp room where the most basic foods were stored. Salted meat, a little cheese, and a great deal of grain. Grain was currency, food, and life all at once. Storing food was incredibly difficult. Salt cost a fortune. That's why meat was salted only for major holidays or for long-term storage. Smoking also required time and specific skills. Most foods simply spoiled if they weren't eaten in time. Modern preservatives would have seemed like real magic to them. Grain was stored in barns, which were constantly under attack by rats. That sounds like a minor nuisance, but rats could destroy up to a third of a village's entire supply. Peasants built clever traps and kept dozens of cats. Yet the rodents still found their way to the food. But let's return to the year 1315. When the grain in the fields rotted, the peasants opened their pantries. What they saw there made them shudder. Their supplies were barely enough for a couple of months of strict rationing, and a long winter and spring lay ahead. The numbers simply didn't add up. Imagine that your bank account suddenly went to zero, and you know there won't be a paycheck for a whole year. That's exactly how the people of medieval Europe felt. Their food bank account was completely empty. Panic began to grip even the most steadfast men. First, the communities cut back on portions. 3 meals a day turned into 2, and then into just 1. Children cried from hunger, but their parents could do nothing. Their stomachs cramped from emptiness. It was a slow and agonizing torture. Then they turned to the seed reserve. It was the most terrifying decision the village could make. Seed grain is the guarantee of next year's harvest. Eating it meant killing your future for the sake of the present. But when your children are dying of hunger right now, you don't think about next year. You're just trying to survive today. Modern economists call this eating into capital. You sell your business to buy food for a single day. Logic tells you this is a dead-end path, but a starving brain works differently. It screams just one word: eat. By eating the seeds, the peasants signed their own death warrant. They temporarily satisfied their hunger, but in the spring, they had nothing to plant in the ground. The vicious cycle was complete. Salvation in the present turned into a catastrophe in the future. And this was only the first act of the tragedy. Another problem struck the food supplies. The rains ruined not only the grain, but also the hay for the animals. Cows and horses wanted to eat too, and their food supply had disappeared under the water. People had to take the next terrible step.
It is coming.
I know.
Keep pushing, boys.
Domestic animals in the Middle Ages were not pets. They were valuable tools and sources of income.
You have to get up.
A cow gave milk and bore calves. A horse or ox pulled a heavy plow in the field. Killing a draft animal was equivalent to destroying a tractor today. But hunger changes all the rules of the game. When the hay rotted, there was nothing left to feed the huge animals. The livestock began to rapidly lose weight and die of starvation. Peasants had to begin mass slaughter. It sounds logical, but in reality, it was a disaster. Suddenly, there was a lot of meat in the villages, but the problem was that it couldn't be preserved. As we've already mentioned, salt cost a fortune, so people tried to eat as much as possible right away. It was a strange feast in the face of the looming plague. They ate the meat, knowing it was their last substantial meal. The loss of horses and oxen had far-reaching consequences. Without them, plowing a field by hand was practically impossible. Human strength is no match for that of an ox, and that meant the next harvest would be even smaller.
God help.
The circle of despair continued to tighten. The sheep also suffered, but for a different reason. Due to the constant dampness, they began to fall ill en masse. Infections developed for which the peasants had no medicine. Entire flocks perished in a matter of weeks. The wool that provided people with warm clothing disappeared. People were left not only hungry, but also cold. Let's compare this to the modern world. If your car breaks down, you call a tow truck and get it repaired. For a farmer, his only engine, the horse, broke down, and it was impossible to repair it or buy a new one. The village economy was set back centuries. Even dogs and cats were no longer safe. When regular food runs out, people start to look at their pets differently. This is the harsh reality of survival. Stray animals were the first to disappear from the village streets. Hunger blurs the lines between what is edible and what is not. Surprisingly, pigs lasted the longest. They could feed on acorns, roots, and all sorts of debris in the forest. A pig turned any waste into high-calorie meat. It was a true biological energy converter. But even the forest soon emptied under the onslaught of starving people. There was simply no debris left. The loss of livestock also took a toll on soil fertility. No cows, no manure. No manure, the soil receives no fertilizer. Crop yields, already low, fell to a critical minimum. Nature seemed to be mocking people's attempts to survive. By the end of winter, the villages had become eerily quiet. The lowing of cows and the barking of dogs were no longer heard. Only the sound of endless rain and the moans of starving people. Livestock had been completely wiped out. Now people had to make decisions about people. When the food runs out completely, the family gathers around the table. This is not the kind of dinner you want to imagine. The last crust of bread lies on the table. And the head of the family must decide exactly who will get it. It is a terrifying moment that literally makes your blood run cold. Every family member sits in complete silence, waiting for the verdict. The mother looks at her emaciated children with indescribable pain. The children are too weak to cry or ask for food. The knife slowly descends onto the stale crust, cutting it into uneven pieces. At this moment, a matter of life and death is decided for every person in the house. Modern logic tells us one simple thing: give the food to the children. We are biologically programmed to protect the weakest and most vulnerable. But in the harsh Middle Ages, the rules of survival were entirely different. If a small child dies, it will be a huge personal tragedy for the parents. But if an adult man dies, the rest of the family will inevitably perish. Without his hard labor, there will be no one to work in the fields next season. Medieval communities existed under conditions of extreme resource scarcity. The land required colossal physical effort to be plowed. Without men's hands, the field would quickly become overgrown with weeds and turn into a wasteland. A mother with small children simply could not physically manage the heavy workload of the household. Therefore, the survival of the breadwinner was an absolute priority for the entire household. Sounds harsh, doesn't it? But let's think about this situation more pragmatically. In those distant times, the man was the primary source of income and physical strength. He alone could plow the heavy clay soil and protect his home from raiders. His caloric needs had to be met first and foremost. Only then did the entire group have even the slightest chance of survival. That is why men always received the largest portions of the meager food. Women ate only what was left behind on the wooden table, and the children got only pitiful, tiny crumbs. Modern sociologists call this behavior a pragmatic distribution of scarce resources. The peasants simply called it their only chance to avoid dying together in the cold winter. It was incredibly cruel, yet effective for preserving the family line. Women voluntarily gave up their shares, fully understanding the gravity of the situation. They watched as their husbands ate the last bit of soup and prayed for a new harvest. Infants often died first, as their mothers simply ran out of milk due to exhaustion. The birth rate during those terrible years dropped to practically zero. Life stood still in anticipation of warmth that never came. But even such a harsh system soon ceased to function entirely. There was no longer enough food to sustain even a single person. And then, in the dark peasant huts, the most terrible thing began. Families started slowly getting rid of the so-called extra mouths to feed. The first to fall victim to this ruthless blow were the defenseless elderly. In normal, peaceful times, the elderly were deeply respected for their life experience and wisdom. Now, however, they suddenly became nothing more than consumers of scarce calories. Many grandmothers and grandfathers made this terrible decision on their own. They simply and silently refused their rightful portion of the meager food. The elderly slowly and quietly faded away in a corner to give the young at least some chance. It was an act of incredible and conscious human self-sacrifice. Imagine the willpower required to consciously refuse food in the face of such savage hunger. Your exhausted body screams and demands food every second, and you simply turn away from the table and silently stare at the gray wall. Modern heroes wear bright raincoats in blockbuster movies. Real heroes wore dirty rags in the 14th century. These people left without a word or a complaint, blessing their children. They closed their eyes at night and never woke up again on this sinful earth. They were buried without coffins, simply wrapped in an old mat. But even such a terrible sacrifice could not save their families from starvation for long. Grain supplies were dwindling faster than the long-awaited spring was arriving. The next stage of this disaster was even darker and more terrifying. When there were no elderly people left in the villages, difficult decisions had to be made regarding the children. The well-known legend of Hansel and Gretel was born precisely in such hopeless times. Parents actually took their own children into the deep forest and left them there to fend for themselves. They simply could no longer bear to watch their children, slowly and painfully, starve to death at home. To desperate parents, the forest seemed a more merciful place than an empty hut. There, the children had at least a 1 in 1,000 chance of finding some berries or mushrooms. Wild animals might end their suffering faster than a protracted death by starvation would. Mothers wailed in grief, returning to their empty homes with tears in their eyes. But hunger burned away all human feelings, leaving only emptiness. This is not a scary bedtime story at all, but a harsh historical fact. Communities deliberately turned a blind eye to the fact that there were fewer and fewer small children around. No one ever asked their neighbors in the village any unnecessary questions. Everyone understood perfectly well what was happening behind those closed wooden doors. It was a true collective pact of silence for the sake of the survival of the fittest. To us today, this seems unthinkable and a monstrous crime. For them, it was the only harsh reality of that time. Nature forced people to shed all social and moral trappings. Only the bare primal instinct for self-preservation remained on the surface. Villages turned into harsh survival camps with the most brutal rules. When the familiar bread and meat disappear forever, people begin frantically searching for any alternatives. The human stomach has an amazing ability to adapt to harsh conditions. But what ordinary people ate in the year 1316 is deeply shocking. They began to consume strange things that had absolutely no nutritional value. Common weeds began to seem to people like a perfectly acceptable and tasty side dish. People stripped young bark from trees in the forest and boiled it for a long time in cauldrons. This simple concoction was supposed to create at least a temporary illusion of fullness. The stomach filled with a dense, hard mass, and the unbearable pain subsided for a while. But tree bark provides absolutely no energy to the body. It merely clogs the intestines and causes terrible internal pain in the unfortunate victims. Modern nutritionists would surely faint at the sight of such a medieval menu. People boiled old leather from worn-out shoes, bags, and belts. Leather is animal protein, but very tough in structure. If you boil an old boot for several hours straight, it becomes relatively soft. It tastes like dirty rubber, but back then it was considered a real delicacy. Every scrap of old harness was put to use, as long as it could be chewed. Dogs and cats disappeared from city streets in the very first months of the disaster. They were followed by rats and mice, which were caught in deserted barns. People hunted down any living creature capable of providing even a few calories. No one thought about disgust anymore. After all, life itself was at stake. In the forests, starving people desperately searched for any edible roots and wild berries. But the surrounding forests were quickly stripped bare under the onslaught of thousands of hungry and frantic eyes. People began digging up the bulbs of poisonous plants and tried to boil them for a long time. Sometimes such culinary experiments ended in severe, fatal poisoning. Death from a quick poison seemed much easier to people than the long agony of starvation. Here it gets even more interesting from a biological perspective. Human biology changes radically during prolonged and severe starvation. The body literally begins to consume itself from the inside out in order to keep the brain functioning. First, subcutaneous fat is completely burned off, then skeletal muscles are used up. A person becomes like a walking skeleton covered in pale, dry skin. Internal organs begin to shrink in size, conserving scarce resources. The heart beats less frequently, and body temperature drops below normal. The person loses the ability to warm up even by a fire and is constantly freezing. The unfortunate have just enough energy to lie motionless and breathe quietly. Any simple movement requires an incredible effort of will from the exhausted body. A special substitute bread even appeared for the poorest segments of the population. It was made from ground acorns, dried leaves, and a small amount of flour. After baking, this strange mixture was as hard as a rock and as black as coal. The peasants' teeth would break at any attempt to bite off even a small piece. But this harsh fare allowed the unfortunate to hold on to life for one more day. The most terrifying and unnatural phenomenon of those years was the mass consumption of clay. People ate ordinary soil simply to fill the unbearable emptiness inside their bodies. In modern science, this strange phenomenon is referred to by the elegant term geophagy. Clay contains some beneficial minerals, but it is completely indigestible to our bodies. It was a genuine act of complete and irrevocable despair in the face of nature. It was mainly children who ate the earth, as their bodies demanded some kind of sustenance. Their bellies swelled with the accumulated dirt, creating a deceptive appearance of plumpness. But this was a deadly illusion that only hastened the tragic end. The intestines became clogged with a dense mass, causing inflammation and a painful death. The earth, which was supposed to feed people with its harvest, was now literally devouring them from the inside. Do you still complain about the tasteless food in the school or office cafeteria? Then imagine a plate of hot, liquid mud with chunks of old leather belt. That is a true culinary nightmare, one you could never forget. And such a menu remained a harsh reality for millions of Europeans for several long years. They became true experts in survival in the middle of nowhere in the forest. But the price of this terrible experience was too high for humanity. Hunger changed not only the bodies but also the very psyche of the survivors. They stopped trusting their neighbors and saw every person as a potential competitor for food. Moral values, accumulated over centuries, collapsed under the pressure of basic physiology. The world plunged into a maelstrom of primal chaos, where it was every man for himself. Due to a lack of vitamins and proteins, the immune systems of these unfortunate people had dropped to practically zero. Absolutely any mild cold instantly became a death sentence for an emaciated person. Terrible epidemics began to mow down en masse those who were still somehow managing to stay on their feet. Famine always goes hand in hand with severe and contagious infectious diseases. These are the two ominous horsemen of the apocalypse, who are never separated anywhere. Diseases spread at breakneck speed through the filthy and cold medieval cities. Typhus, dysentery, and scurvy reaped their terrible harvest among all segments of the population. Even wealthy feudal lords could not always protect themselves from the raging infections. The medicine of that time was utterly powerless against such a mass plague. Entire families perished, locked away in their cold stone houses. The streets of once vibrant villages were littered with corpses that simply had no one to bury them. The survivors simply lacked the physical strength to dig deep graves. Death in those grim years became something utterly ordinary and familiar. The exhausted people had forever lost the ability to mourn their deceased relatives. They simply had no tears or life force left for it. When the law stops working, chaos begins. In normal times, theft was punished incredibly harshly. A stolen loaf of bread could get you your hand chopped off, or you could be hanged. But when you're dying of hunger, the fear of the gallows disappears. The gallows mean a quick death, while hunger means a slow one. The crime rate skyrocketed in just a few months. Gangs of starving peasants roamed the roads in search of any loot. They attacked merchants' carts and raided monasteries. Monasteries, by the way, always had the best food supplies. Monks knew a thing or two about agriculture and proper storage. This made them the prime target for desperate people. It sounds like the plot of a crime thriller, but this was everyday life in 1317. Neighbors began stealing from one another. Burying a sack of grain in the yard at night became the norm. No one could be trusted, not even one's own relatives. A strange category of criminals emerged. People deliberately committed crimes right in front of the guards. Why? Because they were given food in prison. Even if it was a moldy crust of bread and water, it was better than nothing. Prisons were instantly overcrowded. The state justice system simply collapsed. Judges didn't know what to do with thousands of food thieves. Executing them all was impossible. Feeding them in prison, even more so. As a result, many were simply released back onto the streets. The cycle of lawlessness spun faster and faster. Now imagine the lives of the guards. Their rations had been cut as well. Many of them began looting at night themselves. Corruption had reached such proportions that anyone could be bought. The main currency was no longer gold, but ordinary wheat. The wealthy feudal lords locked themselves away in their castles. They had supplies, but they feared riots. The castle walls became their only defense against the enraged mob. Peasants stood beneath the walls, begging for a piece of bread. But the gates remained firmly shut. The lords understood, If they opened the doors, the mob would tear them to pieces. But even sturdy walls did not always save them. History has preserved records of several successful castle sieges carried out with pitchforks and axes. A starving mob feels no pain and fears no arrows. It is the most terrifying force on earth. They were driven forward by an instinct stronger than any weapon. In the cities, the situation was even worse. A villager could at least go into the forest for bark. A city dweller was trapped in a stone jungle. Bread prices had skyrocketed hundreds of times over. Inflation was so severe that modern economic crises seem like child's play. People paid a fortune for a single loaf of bread. Society's morality had completely collapsed. People stepped over corpses in the streets without even turning their heads. Compassion had become an unaffordable luxury. Only cold calculation remained. And that calculation drove people to commit the darkest crimes in history. Where was the government in all this chaos? The kings of England and France desperately tried to somehow remedy the looming catastrophic situation. They issued strict decrees to immediately freeze prices on grain and other basic foodstuffs. The rulers naively believed that simply issuing an order would be enough to make food affordable for everyone again. This is a classic mistake made by absolutely any inexperienced politician in the face of a large-scale crisis. As soon as you artificially freeze prices, the goods simply disappear from the open market. Merchants categorically refused to sell bread at the state-fixed, laughable price. They preferred not to sell anything officially at all, rather than operate at a massive loss. Millers and peasants safely hid their precious grain in caches deep underground. Then they secretly sold these meager supplies on the black market for triple the price. Instead of solving the problem, government regulation only critically worsened the overall situation. Legal food trade in major cities simply ceased to exist. Smart modern economists know this ironclad rule of the free market by heart. If the price does not cover the farmer's costs, all production and sales come to an immediate halt. Edward II, the powerful King of England, personally faced an acute shortage of food. Once, his enormous entourage stopped to rest in the town of St. Albans. And do you know what happened in this fairly large and wealthy settlement? The local bakers could not find bread even for the king himself and his entourage. The vast royal court, accustomed to daily luxury, was left without a proper dinner. It was an unprecedented scandal that shook the very foundations of the entire medieval hierarchy. If the most powerful man in the country cannot buy food, the system is dead. It was a moment of absolute and public political humiliation for the proud English crown. The ruler proved to be just as pitiful and helpless in the face of nature as an ordinary peasant. The church also tried to actively intervene in the tragic events unfolding around them. The clergy explained this endless torrential rain and famine as God's punishment for human sins. Bishops called on the frightened population to engage in mass, prolonged prayers and public acts of penance. They organized massive processions of people who walked barefoot from one church to another. Crowds of believers sincerely prayed to heaven for an end to the downpours and for the salvation of the rotting harvest. Religion tried to give people at least some hope where earthly power was powerless. But such mass religious events had the exact opposite effect on society. Thousands of emaciated and starving people gathered tightly in one place under the cold rain. They stood knee-deep in mud, freezing, and passed dangerous infections to one another. This only accelerated the spread of deadly diseases among the weakened population many times over. Religion and loud prayers simply could not physically feed empty human stomachs. Instead of the long-awaited salvation, these mass processions only rapidly increased the number of victims. Some far-sighted rulers tried to purchase life-saving grain far beyond their borders. They equipped fast ships with gold in the hope of bringing back at least a little bread for the capital. But the main insurmountable problem was that absolutely all of Europe was starving. A weather anomaly had destroyed crops across vast territories from Britain to the eastern borders. Italy, Germany, and France were all suffering the same unbearable calamity in those years. Finding surplus food was practically impossible, no matter how much money was offered. No one in their right mind wanted to part with their last reserves of wheat, even for pure gold. Shiny gold coins could not be melted down in a cauldron or baked into nourishing bread. The export of any food was strictly prohibited in many regions under threat of immediate execution. Local armed militias forcibly turned foreign merchant ships away from their ports. International grain trade came to a near-complete standstill for several of the hardest years. The once prosperous continent quickly fragmented into isolated, suspicious, and frightened territories. Sounds painfully familiar, doesn't it? During modern global crises, developed countries also hastily close their borders to their neighbors. Every politician begins to think only of themselves and the physical survival of their own people. Medieval rulers acted in exactly the same way, succumbing to the general, mounting panic. The nascent trade globalization of the time vanished, instantly giving way to harsh protectionism. Solidarity among European states evaporated at the very first signs of a real threat. Royal standing armies also began to suffer massively from severe chronic starvation. Maintaining thousands of strong, armed men required enormous quantities of provisions every day. And a hungry, angry, and armed army is the perfect army of uncontrollable marauders. Soldiers who had not been paid their wages or given rations for a long time simply spiraled out of control. They deserted their garrisons and went to plunder their own native villages. Military discipline collapsed, and the former defenders turned into common bandits. The state apparatus of violence mercilessly turned against its own taxpayers and the people. Armed deserters broke into peasants' homes and took the last few crumbs they had carefully hidden away. They spared neither women nor the elderly, resorting to brute force for a piece of moldy bread. Yesterday's heroes had become, for ordinary people, far worse than any external foreign enemy. The state had finally lost its sacred monopoly on the use of force and the protection of its citizens. Absolute savage terror reigned on the forest roads. In the provinces and major cities, cynical speculators and corrupt officials ruled the roost with absolute impunity. These unprincipled people shamelessly amassed enormous fortunes on the back of others' hopeless misery. As a result, the authority of any official power plummeted in the eyes of the people to rock bottom. The peasants finally realized that in this cruel world, they could only rely on themselves. Neither God in heaven nor the king in the capital would ever come to their rescue. This painful realization became the main turning point in the mindset of ordinary people. Left to fend for themselves, they began to spontaneously and actively organize themselves for survival. The first tentative beginnings of a harsh and just local self-government began to appear everywhere. Villages began to form their own armed peasant militias to protect their last supplies from looters. They themselves ruthlessly judged captured thieves in town squares and established new laws on their own. The central government lost all control over the situation in the country for several years. Life outside the major cities turned into a daily struggle for the strongest and most desperate. It was a true triumph of anarchy. There is a topic that historians speak of with great reluctance, but without it, the story of the Great Famine would be incomplete. When all options are exhausted, a person is capable of crossing the final line. I am talking about cannibalism. It is the most terrifying taboo of human civilization. Official chronicles rarely mention this directly. Monk chroniclers preferred to use vague metaphors, but the court archives of those years speak for themselves. The documents record dozens of cases where people ate their own kind, and these are only the ones who were caught. The actual number was likely hundreds of times greater. At first, people dug up fresh graves. It sounds like the plot of a cheap horror movie. But for them, a dead body was simply a source of protein. At night, in complete secrecy, they did what saved them from starvation. Moral barriers had been completely erased. Later, the situation became even more terrifying. Rumors began to circulate about travelers being kidnapped on forest roads. A lone traveler risked becoming someone's dinner. Inns became incredibly dangerous places. If you looked weak, you might not wake up in the morning. This was the dark side of survival. Think of the stories about witches who boiled children in cauldrons. Many of these tales originated precisely at the beginning of the 14th century. This is not the fantasy of the Brothers Grimm. It is a transformed folk memory of real events. Society tried to mask its horror with fairy tale motifs. Modern psychology explains this as a state of extreme distress. A starving brain literally shuts down the frontal lobes, which are responsible for morality. Only the reptilian brain remains, craving calories. A person ceases to be human in the social sense. They become a perfect machine for survival. In Ireland, records have survived describing how prisoners in jails ate the newly arrived. Guards would throw a newcomer into a cell, and the next day they would find only bones. No one even tried to investigate it. Everyone couldn't care less. Life had become so devalued that death was merely a statistic. Even in cities where civilization seemed stronger, suspicious remains were found. People hid bones in basements and cesspools. Neighbors might have suspected one another, but they chose to remain silent, because tomorrow they themselves might find themselves in the same situation. It was a collective pact of silence. When the rains finally ended and the harvest returned, people tried to forget it all. No one wanted to discuss what had happened during those dark years. The survivors looked each other in the eyes and understood everything without words. The trauma was too deep. An entire generation grew up knowing what their neighbors were capable of. This shattered their faith in human kindness. The idealized image of a noble Middle Ages shatters into pieces against such facts. A person remains a person as long as they have food. Take away the food for a couple of months, and you will see the true face of nature. You definitely won't like it. By the year 1322, the weather finally began to change. The rain stopped and the sun returned to the European sky. The land gradually dried out, transforming from a swamp into normal soil. The surviving peasants returned to the fields. But these were entirely different people. Europe's population had shrunk by about 10 to 15%. In some regions, a quarter of all residents had vanished. That's millions of lives washed away by the rain and destroyed by famine. Villages stood half empty. There was a catastrophic shortage of labor. And this is where an interesting economic shift begins. Due to the shortage of people, the labor of peasants suddenly became more valuable. Previously, a feudal lord could dictate any terms. Now he had to persuade people to work on his land. Workers began demanding more food and lower taxes. This was the first step toward the dismantling of the classical feudal system. Those who survived gained access to the best lands. Poor and inconvenient fields were simply abandoned. Yields on fertile plots were much higher. As a result, the remaining peasants began to eat even better than before the crisis. The survival paradox in action. But the nation's health had been undermined. The children who survived this famine grew up short and weak. Their immune systems had been destroyed by chronic malnutrition during a critical period of development. They were ideal targets for any infection, and nature did not keep us waiting long. Just 25 years after the famine, the Black Death struck. Historians debate whether these two events are linked. Most agree that the famine paved the way for the plague. A weakened generation simply could not resist the bacteria. It was a double blow from which Europe took centuries to recover. Climate and biology worked in perfect tandem. The survivors also changed their approach to agriculture. They realized that relying solely on wheat was suicidal. Crop diversification began. People started planting a wider variety of crops. If one type rotted in the rain, another might survive. Modern investors call this portfolio diversification. Storage technologies also advanced. New types of granaries appeared, raised on stilts to keep out rats and dampness. Monasteries began to develop more sophisticated food preservation systems. The fear of a repeat of 1315 drove progress. People never wanted to be left empty-handed again. That famine was a harsh lesson in planning. It showed that a system operating at full capacity is doomed. You cannot live without reserves. Any unforeseen anomaly destroys such a world to its very foundations. And this rule remains true even today. We have simply forgotten it in our warm apartments. Europe slowly recovered. The fields turned green again, and the granaries filled with grain. The ringing of church bells no longer heralded endless funerals. Life took its course, as it always does, but the scars in the collective memory remained forever. Today, we look back on these events from the vantage point of our progress. We have genetically modified seeds and global supply chains. It seems that large-scale famine is impossible in developed countries. We are too smart and technologically advanced for that. But this is a very dangerous illusion. Imagine what would happen in the event of a global logistics breakdown. The supermarkets in your city would be empty in just 3 days. This is no exaggeration. These are the calculations of modern logistics experts. Our world's margin for error is very small. We depend on trucks and ships more than farmers depended on the weather. The system has become more complex, but not necessarily more reliable. People in the Middle Ages knew how to survive. They knew how to grow their own food. They could tell which plants in the forest were edible. Ask a modern office worker to forage for lunch in the forest. The result would be both comical and deeply tragic. We have delegated our survival to huge corporations. It's convenient, no doubt, but it robs us of basic survival skills. In 1315, a peasant would have fought to the end. A modern city dweller would simply sit on the pavement and wait for help. And help might not come. The climate also continues to throw surprises our way. Extreme droughts and floods are becoming more frequent. Of course, we know how to ship food across oceans. But what if a crisis engulfs several continents at once? The math of survival will become relevant again. The history of the Great Famine teaches us the importance of reserves. Efficiency must not come at the expense of security. Cost optimization often leads to the elimination of warehouses and stockpiles. Businesses want to make money right now, but nature does not forgive the lack of a safety net. Think back to the empty shelves during the recent pandemic. People were panic buying toilet paper and pasta. It was a faint echo of that very primal fear. We simply felt a slight breeze of chaos. 14th century peasants lived in the eye of that storm for years. They would have laughed at our panic. It is not the most complex system that wins. It is the one that has a margin of safety for a rainy day. We must learn not to blindly trust technology. These stories aren't meant to scare you before bed. They're meant to keep us grounded in reality. Human nature hasn't changed in 700 years. We're still the same biological machines that need calories. And if you take those away, the veneer of civilization will peel away very quickly. It's simply a fact. So the next time you throw away an uneaten dinner, remember this story. Remember the people who boiled old shoes. Appreciate the abundance we live in today, because history loves to repeat itself. This experience must not be wasted. The Great Famine of 1315 was not just a catastrophe, it was a brutal crash test for all of European civilization. People faced conditions that seemed unbearable, and yet humanity did not disappear. It adapted, paying a monstrous price. The impossible decisions made by peasants are horrifying. Giving up food for the sake of their children, slaughtering draft animals, banishing the elderly. All of this sounds barbaric to our ears, but it was precisely these decisions that allowed society not to die out completely. It was brutal Darwinism in action,